Everdark, Episode 88, After. Last on Everdark, Christian stole away to meet with his blood brother, Elgar. His intention was to protect Balthazar's good heart from assisting Elgar before he knew if Elgar was good or bad. But in the end, it is Christian who begs Balthazar to help the starving fledgling. Balthazar stared at the dirty, filthy, really, man that looked more like a skeleton than a human being. In fact, there was a skull beside him. Why did he have that? But then Christian's face filled up his field of vision, and there was such anguish there.
Balthazar, please, help him,
Christian pleaded. But stranger, fine. But you are going to go with Arceus while I deal with this, Balthazar said. Christian opened his mouth to argue. He didn't need to read minds to know that's what was going to happen. Non-negotiable. Christian's mouth snapped shut, and he nodded. No, I. Good. Go, now. Balthazar pointed towards where the confessor stood, a few feet away, arms crossed over his massive chest, hands hidden by his formal robes. Christian cast one glance back at Elgar, who remained huddled by his pet's skull on the fountain. Then he shuffled over to Arceus, who put a hand on his shoulder and led him away. Fiona remained. She came up behind him.
Do you need assistance?
She asked. I'm not sure, to be honest. He sighed.
He needs to be fed. He needs more blood than Seer.
Fiona frowned. And he's more likely to lose control than her as well, Balthazar said. It was not a guess. He could feel the thin edge of control that Elgar had on himself. Madness danced with him. He is Eiros's fledgling. My fledgling. But I feel only Christian in my heart. Yet Elgar was his responsibility. And Christian would kill him if something bad happened to this strong yet fragile vampire. Keep near, Fiona. I might need you to transport him somewhere quick, where he can't hurt anyone, Balthazar requested. She gave a brief nod and stepped back again. Near enough to help, but not to take any attention. For a moment he realized that the two of them were working together rather well. When her forgotten fledglings pop out of the woodwork, I suppose I will have to assist as well. He glided nearer to Elgar, who was stroking his pet skull and murmuring soothing words to himself. A prick of guilt went through him. Elgar was clearly suffering. This was his fledgling. Christian was his fledgling, but also more. Maybe that should be the difference he held. Not fledgling or no, but lover or friend. He cleared his throat. Elgar shifted. He was intensely aware of Balthazar, but it was almost as if he wasn't quite sure if Balthazar was real. Who's your friend? Balthazar asked, even as the answer popped into his head. Oh, yes, you. Elgar's voice was soft, ghost-like. I still can't quite let you go. Balthazar stared at the skull with fangs. It was missing the lower jaw, but he amused himself in thinking the skull was handsome. Eiros in the past was handsome, maybe more handsome than he was now. It was bizarre to think that had been him. He reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the bone beneath the skin, and swallowed. That had been him. Are you going to be speaking to my skull? Like in Hamlet? Balthazar smiled mirthlessly. Alas, poor Eiros. I knew him as a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now, how abhorred in my imagination it is. It was only after he proudly quoted Shakespeare from memory that he realized Elgar had no idea what he was talking about. Shakespeare had not been around when Elgar went into the dirt. How old was he? How long ago was the war? Elgar was a Teuton name, so far older than Balthazar likely was now. When had the Teutons been around? Weren't there individual tribes or something? Maybe they weren't even called Teutons. He shook himself as he realized something else. You speak English brilliantly, but then so did Daemon, and it wasn't his mother tongue, Balthazar remarked. It's the same way you can speak any language. You learn it by... Elgar touched his pale as marble temple. That allowed him to see Elgar's face as he lifted his head at the same time. black hair that hung down in waves to his shoulders. It obviously had stopped growing at one point. Otherwise, he'd have hair longer than Rapunzel's. That thought almost made Balthazar want to laugh, but he knew it was nervous laughter and inappropriate. He bit his inner cheek to stop it. Languages are just ways of relaying our thoughts, Elgar continued. In that way, language differences are not real in any sense, not for us, your children. I suppose you're right. I mean, of course, you're right. I just hadn't thought of it that way. Balthazar had just accepted his language skills. That he could learn a language in moments as if he was a natural had just seemed right. Now he realized the source of it. Hadn't he teased Charlie for his inability to do the same thing? Have you really thought of yourself as ordinary all this time? Just one of us? Elgar asked. Balthazar opened his mouth to say something pithy, but stopped himself again. I don't think those that know me would say I thought ill of myself. But yes, I thought of myself. Still think of myself actually to be just like everyone else. I suppose that comes from. He thought of Roan then, of course. If there was anyone who could make him feel like an insect, it was his old master. Well, I don't have all the answers. I imagine an immortal would have those. Lots of them, anyways. A small smile graced Elgar's thin lips. He kept staring at that face, willing to remember something, but he didn't. Elgar was a stranger to him. Was he really Eiros if he couldn't remember one of his own fledglings? A fledgling that had loved him enough to burrow with his skull into the earth and stay there until he called. You never thought you knew everything. You were always very aware of what you didn't know. That's why you tried to turn as many of the great thinkers of the age that you could. Knowledge was power. Another small smile. Christian has a very scientific mind. Yes, Balthazar shifted uncomfortably. You don't like me speaking of him. I understand. He's yours. You want to keep him safe in word and deed. Even my speaking of him is dangerous in your view, Elgar murmured, feeling Christian's disapproval. And it wasn't his imagination. He was feeling it. Balthazar sighed. Interrogating Elgar was not what he should have been doing. Tell me what you need. How can I help you? Balthazar asked, nose wrinkling slightly as he smelled the musty earth scent rising up from his winding sheet, or whatever he was wearing. I need. Elgar licked his dry, cracked lips. Your blood. I know you won't give me that. You're envisioning me ripping out your throat. I wouldn't. I would never. Elgar swallowed. But you wouldn't let a friend do that. You do not even know me. So something else will have to be done. Yes, absolutely. Christian, would you have wanted me to feed him? No, I don't think so. He really wasn't asking Christian. He was actually pretty sure that Christian would have told him to do it, even if it hurt Christian to see it. But no, he wasn't doing it. He did not wish to. So what is the alternative? He asked when Elgar tried to stand but sank back down almost immediately. There is a device down in the dungeon of the spire that will help me. It needs 5 humans to fuel it, Elgar said after long moments of breathing hard. The dungeon, where my favorite person is. A niggling thought came into his head. Is Elgar working for Cully and wants him to get into the dungeon to release Daemon or give him a second death? But one sweep of Elgar's mind told him no. The vampire had truly dragged himself out of the earth at Balthazar's call. The yearning for him staggered him a bit. He frowned. He knew that one couldn't help everyone, that one had to armor oneself to the emotional turmoil turning away from someone, but Elgar was his fledgling, not his lover, his fledgling, whether he remembered him or not. I've been kinder to Elena, who betrayed me, than this vampire who went into hibernation because I died. I can arrange for both. Balthazar turned to Fiona. She came to attention. He sent to her mind the locations and descriptions of 5 more of the former vampires. He assumed that these 5 would not survive, much like the ones that Seer drained. Luckily, there were plenty of useless former vampires to sacrifice. Was this going to be a thing from now on? Got it? She nodded.
I'll bring them to the dungeon. Perhaps I should teleport Elgar and you as well.
He tipped his head towards the still figure on the fountain. Balthazar turned back. Elgar's breathing was heavy and his shoulders slumped. Exhaustion pulled at him as well as that belly as an empty sack experience. So getting Elgar to the dungeon as fast as possible would be a good idea. Yet he found himself saying, "No, I'll handle it. You get the others as quickly as you can." She nodded and disappeared. "I will get up in a moment. I will be ready to move," Elgar said through gasps. "No, you won't. You cannot even get up off that fountain." Balthazar walked over to the vampire. "But I need to Oh." Balthazar picked Elgar up. He weighed practically nothing. A bag of bones. He shook that image away. The skull, his skull, was enough. Balthazar turned and started to carry him to the spire. "No, wait!" Elgar cried. He had been holding himself very still, as if fearful of touching Balthazar too much, which might cause Balthazar to drop him or something. "What?" Elgar reached back towards the skull. Balthazar tipped his head back and sighed. "You know, I am going to think that you're disappointed with me, that you keep wanting that skull," Balthazar said crossly. "Forgive me, master, but I could not just leave. "I know," Balthazar grimaced. He turned back and leaned down so that Elgar could grab the skull, which he did, and cradled it against his chest. "Besides, we will need this to help me," Elgar said as Balthazar turned back to the spire. Balthazar frowned. How? There was a soft gush of surprised laughter from Elgar. When he saw Balthazar's deepening frown, he said, You're serious? You don't know? I assure you that I have no idea what you're talking about, let alone how my skull can assist. It seems to me that draining 5 people will do far more than old bones will to help you," Balthazar said as he reached the dual high-arched doors of the spire. He was about to shoulder it open, when 2 Eiros vampires snapped to it and opened it for him. They weren't from his house. He thought he vaguely knew them from some of the larger meets the Eiros houses would have. Balthazar hoped he hid his surprise at their actions. After all, he was carrying Elgar. It could have been that they saw his arms were full and helped. But vampires weren't exactly known to be helpful when they didn't have to be, and he was an exile, so they'd been programmed not to help him. Yet they had. He was sure he didn't hide his shock when they bowed to him, though. Now, that action could not be explained away so easily. He quickly passed inside. "You are surprised that they worship you?" Elgar's voice was low, so that the vampires likely hadn't heard. "Worship? Ha ha! You... Oh, wait, you're serious. I did summon them as Eiros. They know who I am, so of course they're trying to brown-nose me." Balthazar lifted his chin up proudly. "Brown-nose? No, it is real worship. You come from another time, Elgar, and clearly you are very fond of me, which blinds you to the reality that most people just want things from me." Balthazar was surprised how weary he sounded at that. He shouldn't be disappointed. He expected nothing less from people, so why did it displease him now? Had he expected for things to be different? Had he expected worship, like Elgar seemed to think he was owned? "And yet, you are unnerved." "What? No, just..." Was he unnerved? A little. In some ways, he didn't want to be treated differently. He wanted to be a part of things. Perhaps a little. "You truly do think you are one of us?" Elgar looked thoughtful. He tugged at his lower lip. "Well then, the use of your skull with the bowl will show you how extraordinary you are." "That doesn't make me feel happy somehow." Balthazar was frowning again. "Everything about you is powerful, Balthazar. Even vampire bones have magical properties." "Magical?" Balthazar scoffed and stopped himself. "I'm sorry, but when you say magic, I suppose it is. We have not figured out how our gifts actually work, so it is magic." Elgar was actually smiling. "You always wanted logic and method applied to everything. No superstition. Elgar coughed, as clearly just raising his voice a little was too much for him. Balthazar picked up the pace. They had reached the dungeon door. There were no vampires to help open it, at least not at first. As he tried to shoulder it open, there was a call from behind him.
Balthazar, let us help you.
It was Seer. Seer! Elgar gasped. He turned his head towards her. She was bathed and dressed in a rather magnificent white dress with feathers and waterfalls of silk. A simple length of silk was bound over her missing eyes. But she didn't need Sophia to lead her. Sophia, now in a matching dress, which made her look a bit like Seer's mini-me, skipped alongside her mistress.
Elgar, oh dear, poor thing.
Seer came directly over and ran her hands through her hair. You know him, and why did that make this seem much more real than before?
Of course he's your second.
Seer enthused as she petted the bony vampire. My what now? He doesn't know. Not any of it, does he? Elgar pushed weakly up into her hands.
No, dear, he's had a hard time of it, but things are turning around,
she said.
You are taking him to the bowl?
Why do I think this isn't just a bowl? Like the skull isn't just a skull? Balthazar lifted an eyebrow. She laughed.
Yes, indeed. But where is Christian? Christian needs to be here and see all of this. He'll be fascinated.
If this bowl involves draining 5 people's blood into it, I don't know how he will take it. People of this age, really of any age, would view this as a little barbaric. Balthazar searched for that last word and was disappointed in it. Wasn't quite right.
Don't be silly, dearest Eros. It will help him.
Seer patted his arm. Like that mirror room did? Balthazar had a bone to pick with her about that.
Yes, in a way.
Another pat.
That did help him, even though it was upsetting. He had to see the truth. He wasn't responsible. He was preyed upon. That doesn't make him a victim for the rest of his existence, but it was something that needed to be clarified for him. Don't you think so?
She cocked her head to the side, regarding him with a slight smile on her lips. Balthazar's mouth opened and shut like a goldfish's. She was right, but she was also wrong. She should have warned him. He shouldn't have been there, but he knew it wouldn't have had the same effect on Christian if any of that had been true. Seer smiled one last time at him and leaned down to her fledgling.
Sophia, darling, please go get Christian.
No need. I can call him. Balthazar sent a command to Arceus and his fledgling.
Excellent, Eros.
He was patted again.
Fluffy bunny,
Sophia said to him. What? You saw a fluffy bunny here? Balthazar did not recall any prey animal like that in the Everdark, unless a vampire had perversely bought one here.
No, my kitties. One will be named Fluffy and the other Bunny.
Sophia explained. He blinked. I hoped you had forgotten about that,
Oh, I wouldn't do that.
she assured him. No, of course you wouldn't. Balthazar sighed and rolled his eyes.
Or what about...
He pressed his fingers to Sophia's lips. Surprise me. Her eyes brightened.
A surprise?
Yes, about the names, not the number of cats. He narrowed his eyes at her. We agreed to 2.
2 for me.
No, 2 in total. His gaze was now quite stern.
But Christian wants at least 1.
She fluttered her eyes at him. Christian wouldn't do that to me, Balthazar told her.
What wouldn't I do to you?
Christian called as he walked into the spire with Arceus in tow. Arceus was behind him not because he wasn't eager to see what was happening, but because Christian was moving so very fast.
Because if Sophia says I would, then...
You won't. You wouldn't. Sophia is teasing, Balthazar said the last, looking down at Sophia's upturned cherubic face. Aren't you? She just smiled and swung herself from side to side as was her wont.
Elgar, are you all right? Of course you're not.
Christian said, fussing at the shroud around the other fledgling. I am fine, Elgar amended. I will be. With a fond smile, he said to Balthazar, You still don't like cats? I didn't before. Balthazar's eyebrows rose up. A connection with my past self. Interesting. Arceus let out a deep rumble.
That would be fitting. It has always been a bone-deep aversion.
I always thought your aversion to them was because you'd had one, loved it, and then it died. There are no vampire cats, Elgar admitted weakly.
Vampire cats?
Christian looked thoughtful.
Humanity is the only species that our gifts work on. On this planet, in any event.
Seer answered.
But come, Elgar is suffering and there is no need.
What can help him besides blood?
Christian looked between the three of them. Something undoubtedly horrible and terrifying, Balthazar murmured.
It would be agonizing for him to simply drink his way back to health. He'd go mad well before then. I was at least fed some and am an immortal, so I am different. He has had nothing, shutting his body down until now.
Seer explained.
So we need to do something more drastic.
She opened the door to the dungeon. The now familiar mouldy, earthy scent rose up. It reminded him of Elgar's current scent, but there was another smell now too. A familiar one. But it didn't make his stomach rumble with hunger. It was somehow sickening. Blood. Blood and magic. He carried Elgar down the stairs with Christian beside him, constantly checking to make sure Elgar wasn't jostled too much. Christian understands the difference between fledgling and lover. Of course, he's completely ahead of the curve on most things. When they reached the bottom, Balthazar wasn't sure what he expected to see. Fiona, with 5 former vampires standing there with glazed unknowing in their eyes. He hadn't noticed any doors to any other rooms, let alone some bowl down there. But the moment they came down the last step, he saw Caemorn at the front of the bars, staring to his left. There was a door. It had seemed like a decorative panel of stone, but it was a door. Christian skirted around and looked inside. He stopped and cocked his head to the side. Balthazar moved behind him and looked over his shoulder. Through the door was a vaulted stone chamber. It was empty, except for what looked like a huge brass bowl, about 6 feet in diameter and just as deep, sat on a pedestal in the exact center. There were 5 leaves that jutted out from the edge. At least, they were shaped like leaves, but were more like knives with channels that ran from the tips to the bases that then drained into the bowl inside. Fiona and the 5 former vampires were already in there. She had positioned each of the former vampires in front of each of the leaves. He met her gaze. Her mouth opened and shut a moment before she managed to say,
I just knew.
Wyvern, of course you knew. You had to do this for your second when her fledgling passed and she hibernated to exist beyond the pain for a time.
Seer said. Wyvern? Elgar cocked his head to see Fiona. The 3 of you are here. And King Daemon, are you all back? I am wondering if any of us ever really left, Balthazar murmured.
Now, you should set Elgar and the skull into the bowl,
Seer instructed. Balthazar hesitated only a moment before carrying Elgar inside the room and did as she said. Elgar seemed so small that he was practically swallowed by the bowl. Elgar curled down there, holding on to his skull as if it were a sacred object. Balthazar stepped back. He nearly bumped into Christian, who was practically on his heels. He had expected the young man to retreat when he saw what was clearly some kind of terrible sacrificial device. But Christian was touching it and murmuring things.
It's cold. Why is it cold? And why?
Balthazar grasped his shoulders and pulled Christian away from the thing.
I'll explain everything later. But though I have no doubt that Balthazar picked worthy sacrifices, there's no need for them to suffer any longer than necessary. Balthazar, if you would.
Seer nodded her head towards the former vampires that all stood facing the leaf blades. She wanted him to order them to step forward, so that the leaf blades pierced their flesh.
Will you be all right seeing so much blood, Lady Seer?
Arceus asked gently. She smiled fondly at the confessor.
Yes, I will be fine, though I will need to feed in another hour or so.
Arceus bowed his head respectfully. Sophia took her mistress's hand. All right, let's get this party started, Balthazar breathed. He took in a breath and willed the form of vampires to simply step forward and to not stop, even as the leaf blades sliced into their stomachs. Blood should have sprayed out, spilled on the floor, dripped down their fronts at least, but it did not. Instead, a stream of blood flowed along the veins of the leaves and started to fill the bowl, and filled and filled. It should have taken a long time. Not all the blood should have left them, but it did. Bare husks were left behind that turned to dust and collapsed to the floor in piles of ash. The bowl, though, was full, and with it, Elgar and the skull were completely submerged in a shimmering pool of crimson.
This shouldn't be possible.
Christian murmured.
What happens next?
We wait.
Seer answered.
But Elgar is worth waiting for. He will be especially useful for what is to come.
The war with Calais? Balthazar asked, still unable to pull his eyes away from the still bowl.
No.
Seer said, and appeared amused.
After.
Arceus's brow furrowed.
What happens after?
Elgar has the unique gift of suggestion. He can whisper in one ear and infect a city, a nation. People aren't directly controlled, but they follow that suggestion no matter what.
Seer was carding her fingers through Sophia's curls.
It will be very, very useful.
For what?
Christian repeated the other's question. Balthazar knew, and he didn't know if it was excitement or fear he felt as he said, "For when Daemon takes over the world." Join us next time for episode 89, Older Brother.
If you want to support this podcast and get the unedited episodes, we actually have something better than a Patreon. I have my own serial subscription website, wraithrain.com. It's an old-fashioned paywall site, just like Netflix or Crunchyroll. With a membership, you do get the uncut versions of Everdark with no intros, outros, or edited parts. Just the chapters as they were meant to be heard before we've had to make it all Disney safe. If this sounds interesting to you, try us out for a month. The link to sign up is in the notes. The most you'll pay is $9.95 a month, and you'll be directly supporting us, real people, not big corporations like Amazon or Netflix, not content created with AI. Wraith Rain is a small team of actual humans doing the best we can to transport you with romantic action and adventure stories. We really thank you for your support.